Right now. That's embarrassing. Let's do that all over again. Thanks, Dylan, for letting me know. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Arturo. I'm an artist and a technologist, and in this channel, I share the wealth of knowledge of the different tools and technologies that I use every day for digital and physical self-expression. So if that's your jam, certainly consider subscribing. As you can tell, we're still getting things started here on the channel by way of live stream, so I apologize for that mic not being live, but we're live now. And what we're doing today is actually bringing in your logos into Blender and using them inside Blender as SVGs in order to take that logo in an SVG format. If you're unfamiliar, we'll cover what that is, and animate it just as you saw the starting soon screen just now. So I'm actually going to flash back to that. I apologize if you were tuning in and you're wondering why the audio wasn't there. It's here now. We're going to flash back to the starting soon screen, which is all made in Blender. So as I was saying, while muted, I put all of this together in Blender maybe about my second or third month in, because I figured that if I wanted to start doing these live streams, I would actually need some form of starting soon screen and an actual be right back screen, a thanks for watching screen, stuff like that. And so I figured, hey, I may as well just put it together within Blender. It's a little bit, it was a little bit of a challenge at first, but as I mentioned, I will be here to kind of help you with it. So if you have any questions along the way, if you're playing along at home, certainly feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll be sure to take a glance and try to get those answered right away. And we'll jump right into it in a couple of seconds. But first things first, let's switch over here to our Blender screen. So if you haven't downloaded Blender already, I recommend that you do that if you want to follow along, and will bring me up. Here I am. And we'll get things going. So your Blender startup sequence might look a little bit different than mine. I've actually changed quite a bit of my startup file, but that's okay. I'm actually going to go ahead and delete all of this. And if you're new to Blender or you haven't been in one of the B3D and chill streams, you should know that at the bottom left corner of the screen over here where this mouse button is, you'll see all the different keystrokes that I'm pressing. So if I add a cube, for example, with Shift A, you'll see that. If it's a bit small, let me know, and I can try to blow that up and make it a little bit bigger, a little bit easier to see and to manage. But that's so that I don't have to say out loud everything that I'm doing, even though, to be honest with you, I'll probably end up doing that anyway. So we won't need this cube. I'll get rid of it. And again, if you're doing this for the first time, I'm going to take it kind of slow. This is not necessarily going to look exactly how it might look on your screen. I have a couple of add-ons that help me facilitate some of the workflows that I like to use. Like, for example, by bringing up the N panel here, which you can do by pressing the key N. You'll see there, bottom screen, it should say I'm pressing N a bunch of times. I actually have an add-on called Photographer, for example, which allows me to add a camera to my scene, and with some degree of ease, change things like the focal length of that camera. Let's add a cube in here for reference real quick. So we'll see 50 millimeters focal length, and then here we'll go to 16. I can change the exposure, the resolution. Let's say I wanted to go to a 1:1 format for something like Instagram. I can do that if I want to. And it gives us this nice camera toggle here so that I can lock my view to the camera and keyframe it, rotate with ease, and navigate around the scene. You don't need this add-on. I believe there is a free version on Blender Market, which I can drop a link to if that's of interest to you. But we can accomplish all the same results by using Blender's native camera settings, which you can get to here under render properties. It actually, if you're not familiar with cameras and photography, this logo is actually the back of a camera. I'm sure, hopefully you've seen one before. That's what that looks like. If you were wondering, where can I find all my output settings? It looks like a printer. So it's this output properties here. And so some of these icons kind of help you get the hang and the idea of what you're doing within Blender. All right, without further ado, let's get to what we came here to do today, which was learn how to animate a logo. So first things first, we'll need one. I have a logo and I'm going to bring it in by going to the File menu within Blender. You can find that at the top left of the screen. And I'm going to navigate to Import. This prompt will allow me to import a bunch of different file types, one at a time. And in this case, we're looking for SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. And if you're unfamiliar with the file type, what this does is it allows us to infinitely scale our file, in this case, a logo. And so what that means is that you won't necessarily lose any visual resolution because it's just using fancy math to scale our logos up and down and to whatever dimensions and sizes we want them. And this is a really helpful file type if you are a designer, because it allows you to send someone a file and have them be able to size it at will. So this is really helpful. So you'll see I brought that in again, File, Import, SVG. I navigated through my file system. You won't see the screen that shows up on my end that allows me to go through my files, because for security and safety reasons and privacy, I've disabled the live stream from doing that, but you should see it on your screen. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat and I'll feel free and I will answer them. So now we have this logo here. If you don't know already, it's a logo of my initials. This is the letter A in my name, the letter J in my name, and the letter R. This logo was made by a dear friend of mine, Luke Jackson, who made it for me a couple of years ago at my request to make something clean and simple. And he nailed it. So Luke, if you're watching, appreciate you and thanks for this. And today we're going to be animating this in Blender, just as you saw at the beginning of the scene. Or maybe we'll be taking it a different route. So let me quickly put an eye on the chat, make sure I'm not missing any questions. Looking good. And gonna take a water. This is a sip of water. This is my reminder to save file, which we can do by Control S and save. And I'll name this something .blend, AJR logo stream .blend, for example. And now you will see here at the bottom that the file is saved. I recommend that you do this really often, especially if you are new to Blender, new to these technologies, because sometimes things go wrong and you're going to want to go back to a better time where you didn't necessarily have some of the mistakes so present. So I'm going to take a swig. And we'll jump back in. So we have the file and we've brought it in as an SVG. And if we hit the tab button if we hit the tab key, we can actually see the different vertices that make up this SVG, and we can manipulate them as we want. So we're not going to actually be moving them in just any direction. We're going to move them up or extrude them. But first, let's stay organized. Let's rename this curve to the appropriate name so that we can keep track of it if we want to add more things to our scene. Okay. And so here we have it. I'm going to go to the modifier properties, and under modifiers, I'm going to apply a subdivision surface modifier. This will make my logo all wonky. I'll give it 2 levels of subdivision in the viewport and set it to simple so that we return to the original shape. And what this will accomplish, if I click here on this drop down caret and apply it, transform curve to mesh. And apply it, is that it will actually give me more points to work with. So now we're actually going to do what this prompt here so kindly reminded me to do, which is to click on the logo that we've brought in, and under convert, we're going to convert it to a mesh. And now we're no longer working with curves, we're actually working with a mesh. And if I select the tab menu and I go to the vertex selection by pressing 1 on the numbers that are at the top of the keyboard above the QWERTY, QUWERTY keys, you'll see that now I have more points to work with than I had before. And this is important when we start applying materials and when we start manipulating this logo in any way, because the more of a subdivision that we have, the more room that we have to play with without things getting warped or not looking good. So from here, there is several different ways that we can go about applying some thickness to this. If we go to the rendered view right now, you'll see my world in Blender is all white, and that's because I've set my shading to be that way. But if I were to, for example, apply this HDR background in the back, which is just a sort of a forest scene to give us some realistic light, you'll note that we kind of lose the logo. We don't really see it. So that's why I've set it to white for now. We can get fancy with the way that we want things to look later. So I'm going to press the tab button and I'm going to press A. And if you don't have this pie selection menu, you might need to enable it under Edit, Preferences, and then a Preferences screen should pop up under which you can go to Add-ons and select the 3D Viewport Pie Menus add-on and click on that, and that should enable it for you. I'm taking it kind of slow because, again, those screens don't show up on your end, but they do on mine. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. So with that add-on enabled, we can select all by pressing the A key, holding it down, and selecting all toggle. This will select all of them, or we can simply click and drag to draw a box, and now we've selected all our vertices. So now we can press the E key to extrude and the Z or Z key to lock our movements and our manipulation on the Z axis. That's the up and down in Blender. And we can raise it by bringing the mouse up. So now we're adding some dimension to our logo. And already it looks funky in this viewport. So I'll go to the shading preview viewport. But already we've got dimension to a logo, whereas before when we brought it in, it was simply just curves. If you want to learn how to navigate different views, that might be useful. If you happen to have a keyboard that's got a number pad on the right hand side, then you can press 1 for front view and all the different numbers on the keyboard to rotate to different views. And this is good for the purposes of just navigating quicker and kind of working on your blend with some ease so that you don't always have to be moving around. At the moment, I'm not sure if anyone watching is actually following along, but we'll just keep going. So I'm pressing Control R, and this is going to give me more subdivisions. And if I scroll my mouse wheel, I can, if you see these yellow lines that are showing up, this is giving me even more subdivisions to work with, but we'll keep it simple. It's probably about here. And that should be good enough. So now if I go to top view, we see that this disappears because for all intents and purposes, the logo that I'm bringing in, even though we've extruded it upwards, doesn't have any depth on the sides. And so we want to fix that. And Blender's got a really handy tool called the Solidify modifier. So here within my modifier properties, I'm going to add a modifier. And I'm going to add a Solidify modifier, and you see everything blows up. So now if I were to go from top view, as by pressing the 7 on the number pad, we can see that now we have a top view of this, but obviously it doesn't look as pretty and as clean as it used to before, but we can change that relatively quickly by changing the offset here to 0 under the Solidify modifier, and by changing the thickness from something like 0.01 meters to 0.001 meters, so even less. And we'll see that we start to approximate the logo that we had before, but thickened in a way that is a bit more pleasing than the blown out of proportion thickening that we were getting earlier. And we'll still see some warping here if you look real close. For example, here, it looks as though this bit that I'm highlighting is a bit thinner or smaller than this widening here. And that is the case. And we can change that by selecting even thickness. And you'll see that everything just kind of snapped it back into place. And now we have a thicker version of the logo to work with. But we're still looking at it from the top-down view, so we want to rotate it. And with Blender, if you want to move things around the screen, you can do so by grabbing them. And a good way to remember this command is just by thinking of the word grab, which allows us in Blender to press the letter G to grab, and then we can move things around. So if you wanted to place this logo here, for example, you could by doing that. If you wanted to undo that, obviously Control Z. And if you wanted to grab the logo so as to move it and then rotate it, you would press the R key. And if you wanted to rotate it to flip it so that we can view it facing us, if we were facing the front view, for example, is by pressing 1 on the number pad. We can grab it, press R to rotate, X to lock it on the X-axis. You can see here we've got a friendly gizmo that reminds us of which axis is which. So the red will always be X unless you change it in the settings. The Z or Z will always be this vertical axis here. And then the Y will be the one that's facing us or giving us dimension in this direction. Okay, so with a bit of a spatial awareness and understanding of how the world that we're looking into in Blender is kind of laid out, this will go a long way in helping you get your thoughts out into Blender faster. This was one of the things that took me a while when I first picked it up. I hadn't used too many 3D creation suites before then, and certainly not for as long as I intended to be using Blender. And so kind of ingraining that is one of the first things that I tried to do when I was picking this up, as well as the different shortcuts for transformations, as they're called, like for example, scaling, which is simply pressing S and moving the mouse. We'll see here that the logo gets bigger or smaller depending on how close I move the cursor to the object's origin point, which is this little orange dot right here in this case. So S to scale. If you are in edit mode and you have some vertices or edges or faces selected, you can press E to extrude, and those will extrude in whatever selection you have set up here. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're working on today. But just in case you want to come back and review these later, now you know where to get them. So before I went into all of that, our plan was to extrude. Sorry, not extrude, to rotate. So from the front view, we're going to hit G to grab, R to rotate, X to lock it into the X axis, and we're going to do a 90-degree rotation. So we type in 90 in the number pad, and there we have it. So now this is facing us. If we were to hit the front view, now we're looking directly at the logo, and this is kind of how I like to work because it just keeps things simple. If I can know that I have to move something a certain amount on a certain axis. So trust me when I say that it takes a while, but it's really worth getting the hang of it. And I'm specifically going over these really slowly because I know that, or kind of in depth, because I know that some of the people watching are new to Blender and may have not used tools like this before. If you're a Blender Pro, still watch though, because you might learn something new. I learn something new every day, and it's part of why I love this tool so much. So with all that said, finally got this logo. Let's add a camera. So we're going to do that by pressing Shift A, which is how we add anything to the scene. If we want to add a cube, we can add a cube and it'll be real big. And so I'll move this one away because we'll want to use it for our reference, our sizing reference. The default cube in Blender is 2 meters or about 2 meters tall. So for the sake of lighting this later, I'm going to scale up the logo to be almost that tall. We'll delete the cube and then we'll add the camera, Shift A, and we'll go down to camera. You won't have all of these, but you'll have probably everything up from force field up or collection instance up. Again, just because I have some add-ons. Camera, we've added a camera, and now we can look through our camera. If we press 0 on the number pad, we don't see anything. So we'll lock our camera to view. On your end, you can do this by going to View Properties and selecting under View Lock, Lock Camera to View. I have this shortcut here that allows me to do that with some ease. And if you scroll the mouse wheel, you'll move the camera backwards or truck it backwards. Shift and clicking down on the mouse will let you make these sort of lateral or up and down movements. And with that in mind, I'll start to frame this up to something that looks a bit pleasing, keeping in mind that what we'll be rendering will be what's within this orange square that we're looking at here. So all this stuff outside won't end up in our render. It's only the stuff within the orange square that we're looking through. And that's because the resolution of the camera or the sizings of the camera are set to a square aspect ratio. So for example, if we wanted to render it for YouTube, we could do something like 1920 by 1080, and then we'll see that the square, the camera that we're looking through, expands to fit the size of that aspect ratio and those dimensions that were given and that resolution. And now if I were to press render, so hit F12, we can see what that looks like. You can't at the moment because that scene is not enabled within Blender, but I can pull it up for you. So let's go to General. We'll just add a UV editing scene here and the render result. And that's what that render looked like just now. When I pressed F12, because there's no light in our scene, that's what we achieved. So now let's add some light. Shift A, we'll go under lights and we'll add, let's say, a point light because it's a simple one to work with. We'll leave it exactly where it is. We'll press F12, it will render. I'll close the render on my screen and you'll see here on the left-hand side, there's that point light that we were just working with. So now this process of rendering back and forth and pressing F12, this would be really tedious. But if we're working within Eevee, which is the render engine that I'd recommend for you if you're beginning, and even if you're not, it's just real time and really smooth to use. You can use the viewport shading mode, the rendered viewport shading mode here by clicking on this menu on any of the different workspaces. So for example, if I were to go to this one and click here, and now we're getting a real-time representation of our scene. So if I grab this light by pressing G, which we know we can use to grab objects within the scene, and I move it around, now we're lighting our logo. So I'm going to take a pause here and just make sure that I'm not missing any messages. It's looking good. Great. So we have this light, and actually for this purpose, I'm not going to use a point light. I'll use a sun lamp, for example. So I'll use Shift A to bring up the add menu, and I'll add a sun. I'll grab the sun, and you'll see that if I move it around, it doesn't give us that same effect, and that's because the sun, a simple way to think about it is that the sun is tied to this yellow dot right here. So if you were to grab this yellow dot and move it, now the sun's moving. A shortcut, if you're the shortcut type, to get that yellow dot to point in the direction of your cursor, which is this mouse here, is Shift T, and that will kind of snap it to the cursor. So if you move your mouse around, you'll also be moving that light. This might be a good way to work for you. Try it out. And I'll just set this up using some, aesthetically pleasing lighting setup to give us some rim light over here. So this maybe looks good, maybe not. We don't have to render it, but if we wanted to, we could. If we wanted to render it, it will look exactly or more or less as we see it. And now let's get into the subject of adding a background. Since we now know how to bring the logo in and we know how to light it using different lights, maybe not some extreme lighting situation or something that looks really aesthetically pleasing, but we know how to put lights into the scene and how to move them around. Let's work on giving it a background. So I'm going to actually turn off or close this world setup that I've got and bring in a new one by pressing Let's do that again real slow. So here under the shading menu, you'll look for this workspace, which looks like this. It's your shader editor. And here you have the options for the shading for the different objects in your scene. I'm toggling the outline here so that we can see what we're working with by clicking on it, or see what we are selecting. I'm going to select the logo just to set the example and press new. This will give us a new material in the material slots for this logo to work with. And we'll call it logo so that we can keep things organized. And we'll color it, let's say red. And now it's red. And if we want to give the world a different color, we just simply select the world nodes and add a new world node. This one will be named world 001 for me, but it doesn't matter so long as it's the one that's selected. It will be the one that's actually showing up when you're in your rendered view. So you'll see now that the background is this kind of flat gray. But if I were to change it to blue or any other color here in the hue saturation values or in the RGB sliders or even in hex codes, we can use something like one of my favorite testing colors when I'm working on stuff with code or with hex, which is FF00FF, or this really strong, intense pink. So if you have a color palette that you like to work with, if you have a color scheme for your brand, for your logo, you can simply type in the color values into the shaders of the objects that you're working with, or even the world background, and type in something like FF00FF, which will give us, or no, sorry, FF0000, which will give us red, or 00FF00, which will give us green, or 0000FF, which will give us blue. And if you don't understand or aren't too knowledgeable with hex, don't worry. You can just simply click on the color swatch and then just select the color you want and eyeball it. And let's say you have something in your scene that you've brought in and you want to match that color. You can even use the eyedropper and select the color and it will match it. Isn't that amazing? So now we've got this light, sun lamp, and it's giving us some nice rim light, backlight situation here, but let's add maybe one more light, a point light. And we can, by pressing the, actually I'm going to do this in the light properties here, by going to the object data properties. So that's this light bulb, aptly iconed here. We can adjust the power of this light. So let's say we want to go and give us 250, just random number I'm coming up with. Now this light is intense. And we can move it around wherever we like. Shift D to duplicate the light, and this will give us more lights to space out. And we'll just lay out a bunch of lights in this scene just to start shaping it up. That's not too bad. If we want to hide all of this, we can press the outliner. This is what it looks like. Doesn't look great, but it's not bad either. Gonna delete those. And maybe we can adjust the irradiance of the sun. There we go, that's more like it. And add, let's say, a Suzanne, like I had before. One other thing that you can do amongst the, the sort of endless possibilities is actually not provide the object with a principled BSDF shader, which is just the default shader that comes attached to objects when you add a material to them. But you can delete that by pressing X here in the shaders. And just like in this viewport that we have here on the right, when you press Shift A on most every other viewport within Blender, you'll actually get the add menu. And now you get this awesome search bar where you can look things up. So for example, if I wanted to add an emission shader, I would just have to type emission. And as you might imagine, when I plug this in and connect the screen to the screen, the output of the emission shader to the input of our material output on the surface of the material, now Suzanne is casting off this white light. And so she's not affected by the sunlight, or at least not in any way that we can see, because she's giving off her own light. Sounds kind of poetic. And you can see that she's giving off this light. If we were to set the strength to 5, for example, we see that this top of the logo here is being affected by the light, which proves to us that she is emissive. So I'm just going to quickly reset the cursor to the world origin, and we don't want Suzanne to be that bright, not for any reason other than aesthetics. And I'll try to approximate what I had worked on more or less when I was building out that scene. So that's bringing logos into Blender. If you don't have a logo, and adding objects to them, take a quick swig of water, save it. Hope you're doing well on your end, saving, kind of hopefully grasping all of this. If you're playing along at home, we'll delete Suzanne for a moment. If you don't have a logo, but you want to bring one in from somewhere, or you want to just play around with different SVGs, then I highly and strongly recommend that you have a look at Google Font Icons, which I'll paste now in the chat, because this is a collection of a bunch of free to use logos that you can play around with. And it seems like that didn't format properly, so let's try that again. In the chat, Dylan says, Suzanne, you are bright enough just the way you are. Yes, that's true. Suzanne, you're doing great. So let's assume that we're now in this Google Fonts website. So let's go to that. And we are here. So this is what the site looks like. If you wanted to use some of these icons or some of these fonts to then bring them into Blender, that's something that we can do. If you're curious about that, just feel free to drop it in the chat, or if I don't go over it, just leave it in the comments. I will look back at all of them, and might do a follow-up video on this if you like, if we don't cover it here. But for the purpose of this video, we'll be talking specifically about the icons, and we'll be using Blender's inbuilt font library so as to not get a little too kind of off the topic. But we have here, let's say, favorite. What's another one that I like here? The thumbs up. That might be a good one if you're making a logo or some form of animated scene. And bring me up here. Let's see, what else? What else do we have? List, login, we've got calendar. So in order to download any of these, you would just click on them. So as to select them, you'll see up here that that's the selected logo. It'll change each time. This is a great resource if you're using, if you're just a designer and want to use them, if you're a developer and you need some icons for your app or anything, and they're free to use. So take advantage of them. They come in a bunch of different flavors and formats. White, black are the color options that you have, different layers of density and sizes. But for the purpose of this video, we'll just stick with the SVG, the first one. So let's say we want to use this favorite. So we'll select that, download as SVG. A prompt will show up on your screen asking you, where do you want to save this onto your computer? So I'll save that onto my computer. You download whichever ones you want. And then I'll meet you back in Blender. So within Blender, as we know, we'll go to the File menu, we'll go to the Import options, and under SVG, we'll look through our folders on our computer for the files that we just saved. In this case, if you wanted to download the heart, for example, it's saved as favorite _ black _ 24 dp. In my case, it might be something different if you are following along at a different point in time. And if we press period on the number pad, it will snap directly to that logo. So now we see that the SVG, or that icon, the SVG lives in the same world as the logo that we brought in earlier, which is great. It's not a It's not the same size, and so it pales in comparison as far as size is concerned, but we can do something like S to scale maybe, and then in the number pad, since we're kind of familiar with the commands now to some degree, we can type in something like 50 and press enter, and so we've scaled it 50 times. If we wanted to scale it 2 times its current size, we'd press 2. If we wanted to scale it 50 more times its current size, we press 50, and whoa, that's a big heart. That's okay. It grew 50 sizes, or maybe some more at this point, and I'll just even it out a bit by scaling it and bringing the mouse down. We'll move it and rotate it. And we can even rotate it within its own space. So you might notice that the point here, the origin, as it's called, is away from the heart. So that means that any transformation, like this rotation or movements or rotation on this on the z-axis, for example, will all happen around this point. And if we wanted it to happen within the center of the heart, we would just need to make sure that the heart is outlined in orange, right-click, set origin, and then we want to set the origin, that little orange point, to the center of mass by surface in this case. And so now any rotations that are happening within the are happening around the origin, which is now in the center of the heart. And hello, Leo. Thanks for joining. This is a great resource, says Dylan. Yes, fonts.google.com is a great resource for fonts to use for your projects, and it's also a great resource for icons. So again, if you haven't taken advantage of that, certainly do, because it's so worth it. So now, as we know, we can press tab to enter the, actually, we can right-click and convert this heart to a mesh. And now we can press tab and enter the, to see the different faces of the heart, for example, that we can manipulate, the different edges, excuse me. And if we press 1 or we cycle up here through the different selection modes, we can see the different vertices. Select those and manipulate them. In this case, we want to select all of them, so we'll press A, select all, and then E to extrude to give the heart some depth. I'm going to press Control R. This will allow me to do a loop cut, and if I wanted to size it, scale it, S to scale, and just kind of move it about slightly. And now we've got a heart with some definition. And if we wanted to get rid of these edges here, we'll go back to shaded view, shading preview view. If we wanted to give it some edges, get rid of those edges, we can simply just right click on the heart and shade to smooth, and then we get rid of them. But as I was mentioning earlier, depending on your topology, and that's the a fancy term for the way that the geometry is laid out. For example, this bit here that's got all of these different edges that are not necessarily laid out in a consistent fashion or distributed along the actual shape of the heart consistently, will warp in this way. And we don't want that. So in this case, I'll just go back to flat shading. That's okay for now. Again, working on fixing that is kind of beyond the scope of this video. But if you want to see more videos like that, or check out videos in which I talk about how to get rid of these lines, for example, then consider subscribing if you haven't already. And now I'm just going to move the heart around. Maybe we'll bring in another shape. And don't go anywhere yet, because in the last 15 minutes, we're going to go really quickly into animating, which is actually relatively simpler than you might think and a lot of fun. Magic Mark, thanks for joining, says you can extrude without converting it into a mesh. Yes, you can. And that we can try that out with a different shape that we bring on. So for example, if we wanted to bring on the, let's import thumbs up and import that as an SVG. As I mentioned earlier, there's about 100 different ways to do all kinds of operations in Blender. And just to keep things tidy, let's make sure that we're naming everything properly. So we'll name this heart. Let's select this one, see what this gets us. This is the thumbs up. So what's this? Another thumbs up? Huh. I see. Okay. So we'll try this. Magic Mark says you can fix that by adding an edge split modifier. Let's give it a go. Why not? This is part of what I love about streaming is you learn new things while doing it. So we'll add a modifier. We're looking for edge split. And if I change the edge angle, let's see what happens here. Not seeing. Do I have to apply it, Mark? Let's try applying it. Didn't work. But that is one of the things that you should know about Blender is that if you can just try things, and the worst thing that can happen is that it will just crash. And that's really unlikely to happen right at the beginning. So don't be afraid to break things or to just try them out because, again, the worst thing that will happen is Blender would just close on you. So because you're good at saving and you save often, that's not really a problem, right? So I'm trying to figure out right now why we have all these different curves. I don't think we need them. We just need this one, thumbs up. Deleted all of them. I want to get to the animating bit, so I'm going to breeze right through this. But if you have questions about how I'm doing it, you're just joining, haven't done it before, just feel free to drop them in the chat. So just to quickly highlight what Mark was saying in the comments, you can extrude without converting the curve to a mesh. You can do that by selecting the object data properties here. Oh, I see. We'll try that in a sec, Mark. And then going under geometry, you can extrude. Whoop. And this is kind of why I didn't want to do it in this way. And it's just that it's a little bit, if you start sliding the sliders, it can get a bit unwieldy really quickly. But it is a good way if you just type the numbers in to manually change it, and you can always bevel the object a different way. But again, those are kind of beyond the scope of the simple approach that we wanted to take with this video, or at least with this lesson. But let's try that edge split modifier here with smooth shading on. And look at that. That looks much cleaner. No warping. I like it. I'm keeping it. Looks great. Okay. And I promised we'll get to animating, so let's just do this. There we go. So we have these objects, brought them in. We've got, let's say, the like button, and we've got the heart. Let's give them all the same material. We can do that with some level of ease by going to the material properties here. A lot of these menus you can find either on the properties panel here on the side, or by actually diving into the shading workspace, whichever one suits your fancy. If you want to keep it all to the screen while you get things going, totally understandable. And under the different materials that you can browse through that we have in our scene, again, I'll have some that you might not have just because I've set up my Blender to allow me to just quickly access some of my frequently used tools and materials. But we'll go to that logo material that we made earlier, select that. So now that heart is red, and we'll do the same for the thumbs up. Now that thumbs up is red, we'll set the origin of this one to the center of mass, just as before. We'll do the same for this one, just so that when we get to animating, it's a little bit easier. And now we'll check things out here, how they're looking with light. I'm not liking that, so I'll delete that light. And I'm gonna snap my world. And we'll set the strength of the background here to, yeah, 3 is fine. And this will just give us light all over. Magic Mark says the edge split modifier removes weird stuff from all text and curve objects most of the time. Yeah, that's handy. As I was saying, even if you're a Blender pro or you're somebody who uses it really often, I use it pretty much every day. You can always learn something new, and that's what makes it so much fun. And also, you can get things really exciting done. Like if we wanted to just render this out immediately and just use it for one of our websites or an Instagram post or something, we could, and we're ready to go. You know, and you can always come back to this project because you've saved it and open it up later and keep going, pick up where you left off with your new knowledge. So it's a really fun way to move around. Now we're going to the timeline. So just because I didn't walk through that for those that are joining, in the bottom left corner, you can, well, something you can do within Blender is you can bring up workspaces from any of the corners. So for example, if you wanted to bring up a Dragon's Pardon, hey, how are you doing? I'm doing well, thank you. How are you? We are rocking and rolling here. If you wanted to bring up another one of these menus, for example, you'll see that I have this split here and there's another split here. But if I went to any of the corners of the different workspaces that I have open, and I got this little crosshair that's showing up, and I clicked on it, held down and dragged over, now we've got a different workspace, and I can change all of them and navigate through them. I'll let you kind of play and manipulate with what each different one does and looks like, but for the purposes of animating, I like to keep it relatively simple and bring up a menu from down here and set the view to the workspace to timeline and just raise it a little bit so we can see the different frames that we're working with. In this case, we're working with 250 frames total, or 249 frames, I think. And if we scroll, we don't see anything. That's because we have no movement right now. So we've got about 10 minutes to get things going and animated. Let's do it. So when we select an object, if we press I in this viewport, we can insert a keyframe down here in this viewport underneath in the timeline for that object's location, rotation, and scale, etc. You see the menu that's popping up here. So in this case, I'm going to set a keyframe for the location, rotation, and scale of the thumbs up, a keyframe for the location, rotation, and scale of my name, and a keyframe for the location, rotation, and scale of the heart. And if we move to a different keyframe, like for example, let's say 180, and we wanted to move this up here at that point, and we wanted to keep the logo where it was, but we wanted to move the heart down here, we can simply select whichever objects we want to mark a keyframe for. So much like with every other tool, you can select one and then another by holding down Shift and then clicking on the other that you wish to select. And you can press I at that point to mark the location, rotation, and scale. And if I play this back by going back to the first keyframe here and pressing play, now we got movement. So not too crazy, not too fancy, but it's a start. What else can we do? We can keep these here and we can actually move the camera around them. So we'll select the camera at this point, and for you, it might look something like pressing N, going to view here. It says Vi on mine, it'll say view on yours just because I've got, again, a bunch of different add-ons installed here, and I will lock my camera to view. Press N again. And so now the camera will move depending on where I move my, the view and the camera will move depending on where I move my viewport. So if I press I to lock the location, rotation, and scale of the camera here, and let's say I wanted to move to here at this point, but I didn't set a keyframe, you'll notice the camera just snaps right back to where it was before. So you got to keep that in mind. So let's move here. That looks good. I'll set a keyframe here, location, rotation, and scale. I'll read this note aloud just for folks who might benefit from it. Dragon Spartan says you can also Dragon Spartan 12 says you can also make it your default keying set, so it automatically sets a keyframe for all those three things by going to keying in the bottom left corner and then select location, rotation, and scale. And let's do location, rotation, and scale. That's pretty handy. Now we don't have to do that eye selection each time. We can just hit I and it should be the default. And if I play this out, you'll see now we've got the camera movement that we just animated, as well as the movement of the two logos. I'm playing this back in the shading viewport mode, but you get the idea. If I were to swap it back to show us the world shader, it's the same. And let me just quickly remove this. And so now we've got a very simple animation. It lasts about 10 seconds, and it took us, minus all my talking, about half an hour to put together. So that's not too bad. If at this point you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. This is about where we'll adjourn today. At this point, if you wanted to render this out, you could go to your your output properties and select your output folder on your device. This will look different depending on the way that you've laid it out. But if you press on this folder, you can navigate directly to the folder in which you want your animation or your frames to be output. In this case, I've got my file format set to JPEG. But if you wanted to render out a video, you could click on FFmpeg video and then select the encoding and encode it as an MPEG-4 or an MP4. And at that point, when you go to render and render animation or press Ctrl F12, all your frames will start rendering one by one. And at the end, we'll all have saved as an MP4. That is one way to do it if you want to do it sort of quickly. But the recommended way to export frames from Blender, at least from what I've been told and what I like to do, is to set it as either JPEG or PNG, depending on the project that I'm working on, and render the frames one by one as images so that if Blender crashes or something goes wrong, I can kind of catch it before it's all finished. And then at that point, I'll take it into something like DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere, stitch all the frames together as a video, because videos and movies are just frame after frame after frame after frame. And then we have the video. At that point, you can color it however you like, tweak it however you like. So those are two ways that you can do it. You can, again, set your file format to FFmpeg video, set the encoding to MP4, and this will just render out a video that's ready for you to use at the risk of potentially crashing Blender and then having to do the whole process all over again. Or you can render it as a JPEG. As Magic Mark notes, OpenEXR is the standard, and that is true, but it is a relatively finicky file type to work with if you're unfamiliar with it, especially if you're new to these sort of tools. So pick your poison: JPEG, PNG, OpenEXR, whatever you like. These will all work depending on your file type. If you run into any issues kind of following along, feel free to let me know in the comments if this video is still up, and I will get to those. But other than that, thanks so much, everyone, for hanging out. Thank you to Little Gelato, Dragon Spartan 12, Magic Mark, Marco, I see you there. Thanks for joining as well, Ellie, everybody. And this has been that. So at this point, I'll just hang out and chill with everybody for a little bit. We can just get to enjoy the simple animation that we made together. Hopefully you learned something. And that's been us. See, Dragon Spartan says, preferably you always want to use PNG. I will disagree with that, because PNG files, while they give you more room to play around with than JPEGs might, PNGs do tend to be on the heavier side, so they'll be some number of megabytes bigger than other files. And PNGs, if you don't have your alpha properties set correctly, might give you some unexpected results, especially if you're just starting out. But I understand why you would say that you want to always use PNG, because it gives you the most room to play with if you're post-producing or compositing your images afterwards. So it's a good note, but maybe not so much so for people who are just looking to make a quick render and have it look relatively the same from how they output it. Again, these are the sort of things, whether you're using JPEG, PNG, or OpenEXR, that really just take some practice and research, and honestly some mistakes to get a selection done. You have a great day as well, Spartan, and Gelato, thanks for joining. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Discord and I'll happily try to answer and tackle them. All right, friends, this has been us. Hope you enjoyed the stream. Thanks again so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.